I was unconscious for 43 days. That's what they told me afterward. 43 days of nothing. No light, no sound, no awareness of the world spinning without me. And the last thing I remember before the dark took me was the smell of hay and diesel and a Texas sky going sideways above my head when the horse threw me. I didn't know it then, but while I was lying in that hospital bed like a man made of stone, my father signed a piece of paper that changed my entire life. He signed my name to a marriage certificate. He pressed my hand to the paper like I was still in there somewhere, still capable of choosing. Maybe he thought he was protecting the ranch. Maybe he thought he was doing me a favor. What I know for certain is that when I opened my eyes for the first time in 43 days, the first thing I saw was a woman sitting in the chair beside my bed. And the first thing I felt was her lips on mine. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us what you'd do if a stranger kissed you awake. We read every single one and leave a little heart for our favorites. Her name was Ellie Hayes, 26 years old, youngest daughter of a family that had worked the eastern edge of my property for 2 generations. She had dark auburn hair that fell past her shoulders, green eyes so steady and calm they could make you feel like everything was going to be fine even when nothing was, and a mouth that always seemed like it was deciding whether or not to say something honest. She wasn't tall, maybe 5'4" in her worn leather boots, but she had a kind of stillness about her that made the room feel smaller and quieter whenever she walked into it. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse tucked into dark jeans the day I woke up, and she smelled like lavender soap and something warmer underneath that I couldn't name at the time, but spent a considerable amount of time trying to identify afterward. I didn't know any of this the second I opened my eyes. What I knew was that she was there, and she was kissing me, and my entire nervous system came back online like a generator kicking to life after a long winter blackout. She pulled back fast. Her eyes went wide. She pressed both hands over her mouth and made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a word she decided not to finish. For a long moment, neither one of us moved. "You're awake," she finally said. I tried to speak. What came out was not impressive. "You've been out for 43 days, she said, and her voice was shaking a little. The nurse said sometimes. There's research that says familiar human contact can—" "Did you just kiss me?" I said. My voice sounded like gravel dragged across dry pavement. She straightened up in her chair and lifted her chin about 1.5 inches. "I'm your wife," she said. "Technically." That was how I met Ellie Hayes. That was how I met my wife. Let me back up. My name is Wade Calloway. I'm 30 years old, or I was 30 when this started. I've since had a birthday that she made into a considerably bigger event than I'm accustomed to, but that comes later. I stand 6'2". I dark hair that tends to run longer than it should when I forget to get it cut. Gray eyes that my mother used to call storm-colored when she was feeling generous and flat when she was not. I run the Calloway Ranch, 4,000 acres of pasture, cattle, hayfields, and one very old barn that I keep meaning to renovate and never do. Situated outside a small county town in West Texas where everybody knows everybody's business, and some of them make a profession out of it. I had exactly one rule about my personal life before all of this happened. I kept it personal. No drama, no complications, no entanglements that I couldn't walk away from clean. I had built that rule over 30 years and defended it without difficulty. And then I fell off a horse and my father married me to Ellie Hayes. My father, Robert Calloway, always 71 years old, built like a fence post, and under the right circumstances, usually involving a crisis he's decided to solve himself, has the strategic sensibility of a man who is absolutely certain he is right, and the social awareness of a man who has never once been told he isn't. He married my mother when they were both 22 and has had exactly one great love in his life, which ended when she passed 11 years ago, and which he has since decided to impose on the rest of us by way of example. When the doctor told him that I might not wake up, and that even if I did, there could be complications, he apparently looked at my empty hospital room, looked at the stack of ranch paperwork that needed a signature, and thought, this ranch needs a woman in it. I am not joking. He told me this later, just with the confidence of a man who had solved a problem. The Hayes family had been working the east pasture under a long-term lease arrangement since before I took over. Good people, hardworking, quiet. Ellie was the youngest of 3 daughters and the one who had stayed on the property after her sisters married and moved away.
Why you might think that,
She managed the lease side of the operation, kept the books, dealt with the cattle on that section. She knew the land. She knew the ranch. My father, in his infinite wisdom, decided that what I needed, what the ranch needed, was someone with institutional knowledge and a practical disposition. He had apparently talked to Ellie's father, who had apparently talked to Ellie, who had apparently, and this part I still can't fully explain, agreed. I asked her about it once, because she looked at me for a long moment with those steady green eyes and said, "Your father is very persuasive." I said, "He told you I was in a coma." She said, "He told me you were temporarily unavailable." I said, "That's not the same thing." She said, "I'm aware of that now." I didn't know any of this the morning I woke up. All I knew was that there was a woman in my room. She had kissed me, and she was claiming to be my wife. The nurse came in 40 seconds later, took one look at my open eyes, and started crying, which I found alarming. Then my father came in, and instead of looking alarmed or guilty, he looked exactly like a man who had been right about something and was waiting for you to acknowledge it. He spread his arms and said, "Son." I said, "Dad, what did you do?" He said, "Mods, I kept this family together." I said a few other things that I won't repeat. The doctors ran their tests. I was, by some measure, fine, or fine enough. Mild cognitive disruption, some muscle weakness, the standard fallout from 6 weeks in a hospital bed.
Make a note of the dimensions.
They said recovery would take time. They said I needed rest and a low-stress environment.
Morning, Ellie.
They said this to my father, who nodded seriously, and to Ellie, who wrote it down, and then to me, and I assured them I understood, while simultaneously planning to be back on a horse within
really
2
couldn't wait,
weeks.
could you? Right here
I
on the
was back on a
fence.
horse in 11 days. Ellie did not approve of this. She said so plainly and without drama, which I found, despite myself, more difficult to dismiss than yelling would have been. We drove home in my black pickup. Or she drove. I was still technically not cleared for that. Not a fact she mentioned once and then did not repeat, which was more effective than repeating it would have been. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was unsettled until that moment. The pastures were green from recent rain. The herd was visible on the far hillside, moving slowly. The house, 2 stories, wide porch, the old magnolia tree my mother planted in the front yard, looked exactly as I had left it. "You kept everything running," I said. She kept her eyes on the road. "Your father helped. Jake and the boys did most of the real work."
Ellie.
Still,
Thank you.
she
for
didn't
kissing me.
answer. But I noticed her
was
hands
hoping it would
relax
work,
slightly
too.
on the wheel. The first week was an exercise in recalibration. I had a wife. She lived in my house. So she had moved into the guest room at the east end of the hall, which I noted and did not comment on. She made coffee every morning at 6:15, Strong? No nonsense. The way I liked it,
Nice, cowboy.
though I hadn't told her that. She kept the household books with a precision that made my previous system look like a guess. She dealt with Jake and the ranch hands with a quiet authority that they respected without question, which was more than I could say for a couple of them when I'd first taken over. She did not hover over me. She did not ask me how I was feeling every 45 minutes. She did not treat me like a man who had just spent 6 weeks unconscious, which was, more than anything else she did, the thing that made me start paying attention to her. I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what to do with her. In my 30 years, I had operated by a very simple principle. I knew what everything in my life was. I knew what my land was, what my cattle were, what my obligations were, what my relationships were. I could categorize them and manage them accordingly. Ellie Hayes did not fit any category I had. She was my wife, on paper, in the eyes of the county clerk, because my father had decided to solve a problem with a signature. But she was also a stranger who made my coffee right and drove my truck without asking, and had apparently sat beside my hospital bed for several hours a week for 6 weeks. For reasons that I was beginning to understand had less to do with obligation and more to do with something she wasn't ready to name yet. I started watching her, not in a way I was proud of, unnecessarily, more in the way that you watch something that doesn't make sense, hoping it will reveal its logic if you pay enough attention. I watched her walk the fence line in the morning with a notepad, pausing to write things down. I watched her talk to the horses without self-consciousness, standing just close enough to let them approach her rather than reaching for them. I watched her at dinner, sitting across from my father, listening to him with a patience that I was not always capable of, and that I recognized as a skill. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I came into the kitchen, and she was standing at the counter with a mug of tea, reading something, and she didn't hear me come in. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to before I said anything. She looked up, unhurried, and said, "There's coffee if you want it." I said, "It's 8 o'clock." She said, "You're a grown man." I got a cup of coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table. She kept reading. We stayed like that for maybe an hour, not talking, the radio doing the talking for us, and it was the most comfortable I had felt since I woke up in that hospital bed. I didn't know what to do with that either. The kiss was the thing. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She had kissed me to wake me up. That was the story, the nurse's suggestion, the research, the familiar human contact. That was the practical explanation. But I had been kissed before, and none of those kisses had pulled me back from wherever I was the way that one had. There was something in it. Warmth, I think, or intention, or the specific quality of someone who is hoping very hard for something, and putting that hope somewhere it can be felt. I didn't know how to bring this up. I was fairly sure there was no graceful way to say to a woman, "That kiss you gave me while I was unconscious for reasons that were technically medical. I've been thinking about it." I kept the thought to myself and watched her, and waited to understand what I was actually dealing with. The answer came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after I got home, when we had our first real argument. It was about the old barn. I had decided, despite what the doctor said about low-stress activities, to start the renovation myself with Jake's help. Because I had been thinking about it for 2 years, and I needed something to do with my hands.
Simple as that.
Ellie came out to the barn that morning and took one look at what I was doing and said, "You're not supposed to be doing heavy lifting." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "You were in a coma 3 weeks ago." I said, "I'm aware." She said, "Are you? Because you're acting like a man who has completely forgotten that." I said, "I appreciate the concern, but this is my ranch and my decision." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're right, it is." And she walked away. I stood there with a plank of wood in my hands, feeling approximately the size of a fence nail. Jake, who had been pretending very hard to be interested in a rusted hinge, said nothing. I put the plank down. I went inside. I found Ellie in the office, going over feed invoices with the focused attention of someone who was not going to make this easy on me. I stood in the doorway. She didn't look up. I'll take it slower, I said. She turned a page. Okay. That's all you're going to say? She looked up at me then. What else would you like me to say? I thought about it. Nothing, I said. Okay is fine. She almost smiled. It was about a quarter of a smile, the corner of her mouth just barely. And she caught it before it finished and went back to the invoices. But I saw it. I saw it, and I filed it away with all the other things I was collecting about Ellie Hayes. The way she drank her tea, the way she talked to the horses, the way she made coffee, the way she had kissed me back from wherever I was, the way she said, "Okay," like she meant it. Something was shifting. I didn't announce it. I barely admitted it to myself. But something was shifting. Before you get to the part where everything changes, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. Drop a comment telling us what you think Ellie was feeling in that hospital room. We'll leave a heart on every single one. The thing about living with someone you don't quite understand is that understanding comes in layers. I learned the first layer of Ellie Hayes quickly. The practical, capable, quietly stubborn woman who ran a household and a section of a ranch without making it look like effort. The second layer took longer. I found it by accident, the way you find most true things. It was a Friday night. My father had gone into town. Jake and the boys had finished up early. The ranch was quiet in the way it gets on clear fall evenings. That specific Texas quiet that isn't really silence. It's just everything far away. I had come in from the south pasture later than usual and found Ellie on the back porch, sitting on the steps with her boots off, looking out at the fields. She was holding a glass of sweet tea. She didn't look up when I sat down beside her, just moved over a few inches to give me room. And I thought, she already knows I do this. She already knows I come out here in the evenings. She's been here long enough to know. You like it here? I said. She was quiet for a moment. I grew up 2 miles that direction, she said. This land it's in me somewhere. I don't know how to explain that. You don't have to explain it to me, I said. She looked over at me, and there it was again, that almost smile. Except this time, she let it finish. It was a real one, unhurried, a little wondering. And it did something to my chest that I hadn't cleared medically, but was fairly sure wasn't a cardiac event. I said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. She said, I usually do. I said, why did you agree to this? What he asked you? What your father asked you? It wasn't a fair thing to ask. You didn't owe anybody this. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the first star showed up in the sky above the south pasture, which in September in West Texas is the very beginning of what becomes, eventually, more stars than you can count. Your father told me you were a good man, she finally said. He told me you'd built something real out here, and that you'd done it mostly alone, and that you'd been alone a long time, and he thought. He believed. She stopped. I know that sounds naive. It doesn't, I said. I'd seen you, she said. Around the property, over the years. You were always, I don't know, fair. You were always fair. I didn't know what to say to that. I had been called a lot of things in my life. Fear was not one I had thought about particularly. I was scared, she added, almost to herself. When I came to the hospital the first time and I saw you, I was scared you wouldn't wake up. And after a while, that mattered to me in a way I couldn't really justify yet. She picked up her glass of tea and looked back at the fields. I looked at the side of her face. I thought about 43 days of dark and the warmth of something pulling me back. I thought about the specific quality of a hope that goes somewhere it can be felt. I didn't move fast. That is not who I am, and that is not what this was. I moved the same way she'd moved with the horses, close enough to be approached. Not so close, it was a demand. I said her name. She turned. I leaned over and kissed her the way I'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. Slowly, on purpose, like a man who has decided something. She went still for exactly 1 second, and then her hand came up and found the front of my shirt, and she held on. When we pulled apart, her eyes were closed. She opened them and looked at me like she was checking whether this was real. I said, "I know this isn't how any of this was supposed to happen." She said, "No." I said, "I know we still have a lot to figure out." She said, "We do." I said, "I want to figure it out with you." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, in the quietest voice, "Okay." It was the best okay I had ever heard in my life. I did not tell her this immediately. I'm a private man, but I think she knew. That night was the first time I asked her to stay on the porch a little longer after we would normally have gone inside. She stayed. The next night, I asked again. She brought out 2 glasses of sweet tea without being asked and sat beside me without any distance between us. Within a week, it had become the thing we did. Every evening, without discussion or arrangement, the back porch, the 2 of us, and the whole wide Texas night above. She started talking more. I started listening more. I reckon I was always good at the cattle and the land and the machinery of running a ranch. I was considerably less good at the machinery of paying attention to a person. She was patient with that. She did not make me feel like a fool for not knowing things I hadn't had much practice at. She just stayed and let me figure it out.
Morning, Ellie.
There was a night in October when a cold front pushed down from the panhandle and turned the air sharp and clean the way it does in the fall. We were on the porch and she had a blanket around her shoulders and I had my arm around her and she was telling me something about her grandmother that made her laugh. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded, her head tipping back. And I looked at her and thought, this is the thing my father was trying to give me. He went about it in the most wrong-headed way a man has ever gone about anything, and I reserve the right to tell him that. But the thing itself, this woman laughing on my porch with a blanket around her shoulders and the cold coming down from the north, this was worth waking up for. I told her I loved her on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday is special. It's not. It's just Tuesday. But because it was a Tuesday afternoon, and she was sitting on the fence by the south pasture watching the cattle, her hair loose, and she looked over at me the way she sometimes did when she thought I wasn't going to say anything, and I said it. Out loud, clearly, like a man making a statement of fact. She stared at me. Then she said, "Wade Calloway, you could not have picked a more inconvenient moment." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm sitting on a fence." I said, "I'm aware." She said, "You couldn't have waited until we were somewhere normal?" I said, "Well, no."
Ellie.
She looked at me for a long second, and then she said, "I love you too."
I was hoping it would
And then
work
she lost
too.
her balance on the fence, and I had to catch her, which she will maintain to this day was my fault. It was not my fault. I am comfortable with that. We sorted out the paperwork later. The legal kind, the official kind, the kind that says that a marriage signed by a man in a coma and a woman who agreed for reasons she's still a little private about is now a marriage that both of them chose, openly, without anyone unconscious. The county clerk who processed it had been the county clerk for 23 years, and I think she may have gotten a little emotional. Small county. Everybody knows everybody. She had apparently been following developments. My father, when I told him how things had turned out, sat back in his chair on the front porch and looked at the sky with the expression of a man who has been proven right about something important. I told him that being right did not make what he'd done acceptable. He said, "It didn't hurt anything." I said, "That is not the point." He said, "She's good for the ranch." I said, "She's not for the ranch, Dad." He looked at me then, and something in his face changed, softened, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in a while. He said, "No, she's for you." And then he patted my arm and went inside, and I sat there on the front porch of the house where I'd grown up and thought about that for a long time. She came out 20 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one, sat down in the chair beside me, and looked at the same stretch of land I'd been looking at without knowing what I was looking for. She'd known me for 4 months by then. She knew what I looked like when something had settled. "He apologized to you, didn't he?" she said. "In his way," I said. "That's something." "It is," I said. We drank our coffee. The magnolia tree my mother had planted moved a little in the afternoon wind. The south pasture was still and gold in the late October light. "Ellie?" I said. "Yeah. Thank you for kissing me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was hoping it would work." "Did you think it would?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered most things. "I thought it was worth trying," she said. I looked at her. "It was worth trying," I said. I am 31 years old now. I run 4,000 acres of West Texas with a woman who makes my coffee right and argues with me about barn renovations and sits beside me every evening while the sky goes dark and fills up with stars. She is my wife. She has been my wife since before I knew who she was, and she will be my wife until there's no more of me left to speak of. And I don't say that because my father signed a piece of paper while I was unconscious. I say it because she kissed me back from wherever I was, and I have been heading toward her ever since. She still kisses me every night. I still think it's worth it, more than worth it. I'd fall off that horse again if it led me here. Before you go, subscribe if you haven't, and leave us a comment. Would you have agreed to what Ellie agreed to? We'll drop a heart on every single answer. See you in the next one.